First suitor failed at the 42nd minute. I was sitting in the observer's gallery when it happened. Not a seat of any distinction, 3 rows back from the floor, against the curved glass wall of the station's main chamber. Kesteven Treaty Station hung at the edge of the Veth corridor, a neutral platform that nobody owned and everybody used, and the tribunal room occupied its highest level, a wide oval of pale stone flooring, recessed lighting that cast everything in cool institutional white, and a ring of carved delegate seats that climbed the walls, in tiers the way an amphitheater might. The observation gallery was where they put people who had no standing in the proceedings but whose presence was required by treaty, neutral observers, medical officers, compact record keepers. I was the medical officer attached to the human delegation to certify that the biometric equipment being used in the bonding scan was properly calibrated, and that the procedure met interspecies health standards, a formality. Nobody had told me anything different. I watched the first suitor, a Dravathi lord, tall and pale-skinned with the elongated skull ridge his species wore like a crown, step onto the scan platform in the center of the room. The platform was a shallow disc of polished alloy, maybe 3 meters across, embedded with sensifer filaments that the treaty engineers had spent 2 years agreeing on. Above it hung the results array, a curving display panel that would show compatibility indices, biological crossmatch scores, and the binding verdict that the Compact's bonding law required. The Dravathi lord stood with his shoulders back. His court advisor had been whispering numbers to him all morning. He had apparently every reason to be confident. The scan ran for 30 seconds. The array lit up in sequence, orange, then amber, then a sustained flat red. The room didn't make a sound, not because anyone was surprised exactly. More because nobody wanted to be the first to say what everyone already suspected. I looked across the chamber floor to where Queen Vetheri Solan-Cass was seated. She had her own chair. It wasn't quite a throne. The treaty rules prohibited that kind of display on neutral ground. But it was set apart from the delegate ring, slightly elevated, on a stepped platform. And it was the first thing the eye went to when you entered the room. She sat in it the way people sit in chairs when they've been sitting in chairs like that their entire lives. Straight-backed, hands rested on the arms, expression entirely her own. She was wearing a formal court robe of deep gray-green, high-collared, unornamented except for a narrow silver band at each wrist. Her skin was the blue-gray of deep water in overcast light, smooth and entirely still, and her eyes were copper amber, not warm exactly but not cold either. More like the color of something that has held heat for a very long time and is deciding whether to release it. Her hair was close-cropped, dark, touched through with threads of silver that I had first assumed were decorative and later understood were simply hers. She looked at the red display with no expression that I could name. Her court advisor, a narrow-faced official named Counselor Dreveth, who I had spent the previous 2 days watching maneuver around her with the practiced care of someone pushing a cart full of glass, leaned down from seat and said something quietly into her ear. She didn't respond, didn't turn her head, just waited. The Dravathi lord was escorted from the platform. The second suitor came forward. He was a Veth Keely noble from the inner system, shorter than the Dravathi lord, broad through the chest, with the amber-tinged skin and heavy brow ridges that marked the old Veth Keely bloodline. His delegation had arrived the previous evening with 14 members and a great deal of baggage, which I'd been told was normal for the Veth Keely court. They traveled, apparently, with everything they might need for every contingency. He had been presented to me at the opening reception as the candidate with the highest predictive compatibility score in the current pool. He failed at the 37th minute. The color sequence was identical to the first, orange, amber, red. The room had already learned not to react. The third suitor was a Keth Alari diplomat, who had the distinction, according to Ada, of having petitioned for inclusion in the registry himself. 3 years ago, after commissioning his own biological analysis, he had concluded that his markers were likely to pass. He had, apparently, spent a considerable amount of preparation time and significant resources on the strength of that analysis. He failed in 19 minutes. The display went red faster than either predecessor. When he was escorted from the platform, I watched him walk back to his seat in the delegate ring, and there was something in the line of his shoulders that I recognized. Not defeat exactly, but the particular quality of a man who has believed in a thing so thoroughly and for so long that reality's correction lands as a physical blow.
He sat down.
He did not look at anyone. I had been given the list that morning, 7 registered candidates, each from a species with active diplomatic standing in the Solon-Cass Compact. Biological compatibility was the requirement, not preference, not political alignment, but a hard biological crossmatch determined by the SCAN platform. The Solon-Cass Bonding Compact was old law, older than the current treaty framework, and it operated on a simple principle that the species who had drafted it had considered sensible. A sovereign required a bonded partner whose biology could sustain a viable line, and the SCAN existed to confirm that the match was real and not simply politically convenient. 11 years since Vathari had ascended the throne, the required SCAN had been run. For 11 years, no registered candidate had passed. Court had tried everything the law allowed. They had expanded the registry twice. They had commissioned biological surveys of 6 additional species. They had petitioned the Compact Tribunal twice for a procedural exemption and been denied both times, because the law that required the SCAN was the same law that made the throne legitimate. You could not invoke the law to seat yourself and then discard the law because it inconvenienced you. The tribunal had been very clear about that. What the tribunal had also been very clear about, and what Councillor Drevith had spent 2 days trying to obscure whenever human delegation members were within earshot, was the forfeiture clause. If the Queen entered the 7th and final tribunal day without a confirmed match, throne passed to the secondary claimant under the Compact's succession protocols. The secondary claimant was a cousin, a man named Varath Solon-Cass, whose delegation I had seen arrive that morning, 6 advisors, a legal team, particular quality of barely contained eagerness that people carry when they believe a thing is about to fall into their hands. The second suitor failed at the 31st minute, the third at the 19th. The fourth suitor failed in 31 minutes, fifth in 16, the sixth, a Meridian Compact noble with the highest raw biological index score in the registered pool, a fact his court had announced publicly and somewhat prematurely the previous day, failed in 28. After the 6th failed, the chamber took an unofficial pause that nobody called a recess but everyone needed. People moved to the perimeter. The delegate ring buzzed with contained urgency. I watched Varath Solon-Cass cross to his advisor, the flat-eyed young woman, whose name I still didn't know, and they conferred in rapid, low tones for about 90 seconds, and whatever she said produced a small, precise nod from him that had the quality of confirmation. Something he had expected was now confirmed. I spent the lunch recess in the station's medical bay running my calibration checks on the equipment I'd been assigned to certify. The SCAN platform's sensor array used a Velhari standard biometric protocol that I had reviewed in the treaty documentation. It cross-matched cellular bonding markers, not genetics exactly, but something adjacent to genetics, a biological signature that the Solon-Cass species had identified in their own population as indicating deep compatibility. The science was real. The equipment was working correctly. I could certify both without reservation. What I could not explain was why, of the 6 registered candidates who had already failed, and the one who remained, not a single one had come close. The display had gone red each time within the first 40 seconds. The threshold wasn't even in view. When I came back to the gallery for the afternoon session, I stopped at the water station. Outside the chamber doors, there was a small table there with self-service dispensers, the kind of thing a well-run neutral station maintained so that long tribunal sessions didn't leave delegates dehydrated and irritable. I filled a standard cup, drank it, and was reaching for a second, when I noticed that the Queen was standing 3 feet to my left. She was not surrounded by advisors. 2 court guards were visible in my peripheral vision. Stationed at a careful distance, she was standing alone at the water table with a cup in her hand, and she was looking at the window. A long curved panel that looked out across Beth Corridor, all that black distance and the cold light of stars. She wasn't looking at me. She may not have known I was there. I set my cup down, picked up a second one, filled it, and placed it on the table near her right hand, not handed to her. Just near her hand, so she could take it or ignore it as she chose. She looked at it, then she looked at me. Human medical officer, she said. Her standard was precise, the way people speak a language they learned late and then worked very hard to master. Yes, ma'am. You are here to certify the equipment. Right. She picked up the cup. The equipment is functioning correctly? It is. Then the results this morning are accurate. It wasn't a question. I answered it as one anyway. They were accurate, yes. She drank the water, set the cup back down, looked at the window again. My cousin's delegation arrived at 0600, she said. They requested the station's primary conference suite. The station administrator granted it. She paused. They did not need a conference suite when they arrived. They only need one if they expect to still be here after tomorrow. I didn't say anything to that. There is one candidate remaining, she said. Told he is the strongest biological match in the registered pool. I am also told that the same assessment was made of the fourth candidate, and the second. She turned her head and looked at me with those copper amber eyes. Not through me, not past me, at me, in the specific way that people look at someone they are deciding whether to trust with something that costs them to say. Is there anything in the equipment's function that could produce a false negative? No. You are certain. The equipment is working correctly. If it says there's no match, there's no match. She held my gaze for another 2 seconds, then she nodded. The small, precise nod of someone who was not surprised by the answer, and had not needed the answer to be different, only needed to hear it from someone who had no stake in what it meant. Thank you, she said. She walked back toward the chamber doors, without waiting for her guards to fall in. They scrambled to catch up. I stood at the water table for a moment with an empty cup in my hand, and I thought about what she had said. Not about the equipment, about the conference suite. The seventh candidate was Aveth Cayley Noble, and he failed in 22 minutes. The display went flat red, and the chamber was absolutely quiet, and Varath Solon Cass, the cousin, seated in the secondary delegate ring, very carefully did not smile. Councillor Dreveth was on his feet immediately. He addressed the tribunal in the Solon Cass formal register. I didn't have the vocabulary to follow in real time. But the treaty interpreter, assigned to the human delegation, was sitting 2 seats from me, and she was murmuring a running translation into her collar mic. The feed going to a small receiver I had clipped to my jacket that morning because the session was expected to be long. I listened. Dreveth was arguing for an extension. Another survey period. The biological registry was incomplete, he said. There were species that had not been fully catalogued, candidate populations that had not been screened. He was asking for 60 days. He was asking for procedural latitude. He was, in the careful language of a man who had been arguing this exact point for 11 years, and was sitting out of room to stand, asking for one more chance. The tribunal's lead arbitrator, a Kestevan neutral, heavyset, gray-robed, who had presided over this session, with the air of someone who found the whole business mildly exhausting, said something that the interpreter translated as, "The registry is the registry. If Councillor Dreveth believes a species has been improperly excluded, he may file a petition with the Registry Commission. The tribunal cannot act on a petition that has not been filed. Do you have a filing?" Dreveth did not have a filing. Then the tribunal notes that all registered candidates have been evaluated. We will recess until the morning session, at which time we will. I was on my feet before I had fully decided to stand up. "I need to interrupt," he said. The room turned. I had not spoken before. The human delegation had no standing in these proceedings, and the human medical officer had even less than that. I was aware of this. I said it anyway. The tribunal arbitrator looked at me with the expression of a person who has been very patient for a very long time and is reassessing that policy. The human medical officer has observer status only. Interruptions from the gallery. I'm asking to submit to the scan. Silence. Not the polite silence of a room waiting for someone to finish. The different kind. The kind that happens when something has been said that doesn't fit any of the categories the room had prepared for. The interpreter had stopped murmuring. I could hear the ventilation system, hear Varath Solon Cass shift in his chair. The human species is not in the biological registry. the arbitrator said slowly, as though perhaps I was unaware of this. I know. I'm not submitting as a registered candidate. I'm submitting as a medical control baseline. Kept my voice level. I had used this voice before in triage bays in the field, in places where the calm in your voice was the only calm available. The treaty documentation requires that I certify the equipment is functioning correctly and producing accurate results. One standard method for certifying biometric equipment is to run a known baseline subject and confirm the output is within expected parameters. I'm asking to be that baseline. The scan runs. The equipment produces a result. I certify it. That's within my remit. The arbitrator looked at me for a long moment. Counselor Dreveth said something in rapid Solan-Cass that the interpreter translated as, "This is irregular and has no bearing on the tribunal's proceedings." "It doesn't have to have bearing," I said. "I'm not a candidate. I have no standing as a candidate. I'm a medical officer certifying equipment. That's all." From the secondary delegate ring, one of Vareth's advisors, a young woman with the flat, watchful eyes of someone who spends her days looking for angles, said something that the interpreter translated as, "Let him. It confirms the equipment is accurate, which confirms this morning's results are binding, which is in our interest." Dreveth looked at her, then at me. Something moved behind his eyes that I couldn't read. Vathari Solan-Cass had not moved, had not spoken. She was looking at me with the same expression she had used at the water table, the one that was deciding whether to trust something. There was something else in it now. Something I thought, watching her, might be the look of a person who is so far past hoping for a particular outcome that they have stopped being afraid of what they might want. "Seed," the arbitrator said finally. "For the record, this is a medical equipment calibration procedure only, conducted by the human observer in accordance with his certification remit. It has no standing as a candidacy evaluation." "Understood," I said. I came down from the gallery. The steps were cut stone, narrow, and the room tracked me the whole way. I could feel it. 200 people watching a human medical officer walk across a tribunal floor to a scan platform that had rejected every legitimate candidate in the registry. Vareth's delegation watching because they decided it was useful. Dreveth watching because he couldn't afford not to. The Queen watching because, I didn't know why, exactly. Maybe because she was the kind of person who watched everything. The platform was warm under my feet when I stepped onto it. The sensor filaments were not visible at this distance, but I knew they were there. I'd spent the morning with them. I stood where all the others had stood, in the center of the disc, and I put my hands at my sides, and I looked at the curved wall above the platform where the results array was waiting. The scan ran. 10 seconds, 20. At 30 seconds, nothing had happened. The display was still cycling. It hadn't gone amber. It hadn't gone red. It was still running. I heard someone in the gallery draw breath. I heard, from somewhere in the delegate ring, the sound of a chair pushed back, the quick, flexive movement of a person who has seen something they didn't plan for, and has not yet decided what to do about it. 40 seconds the display produced a color I had not seen it produce all day. Not orange, not amber, not red. A deep and steady blue-green. The color, I would learn later, that the system used when the matched signal was strong enough to bypass the standard threshold sequence and go directly to the compatibility assessment. At 43 seconds, the assessment completed. The display showed a number, then a second number, then a third. I did not know enough about Solan-Cass biology to know what those numbers meant in absolute terms. I did not need to. I could read the room. Counselor Dreveth had gone very still, in the way that people go still when the ground has moved, and they are not yet sure where their feet are. Vareth Solan-Cass was on his feet. His advisor, the flat-eyed young woman who had said to let me proceed, was speaking rapidly into his ear, and he was not listening to her. Her voice had been the voice of someone who expected a red display and a clean confirmation of everything they had planned for. And she was discovering, at some speed, that the math had changed. The arbitrator was consulting with her two colleagues in low, urgent tones. I looked at Vathari Solan-Cass. She was the only person in the room who was completely still. Not frozen, still. There is a difference. Frozen is what happens to a body when it can't process what it's receiving. Psst. Still is what happens when a person has been trained by years of holding a position under pressure to keep every instinct behind their face. And they are doing that now, but just barely. And you can see the effort of fit in the line of their jaw and the exact quality of attention in those copper amber eyes. She was looking at the numbers on the display. Then she looked at me. I stepped off the platform. The arbitrator called the chamber to order. It took 3 attempts, each one louder than the last, because the room had developed the buzzing quality of a place where people have just realized that the thing they planned for is no longer the thing that's happening. When quiet finally settled, partial and reluctant, the arbitrator said, "The tribunal will recess for 30 minutes to review the display output. All parties will remain in the station." I went back to the gallery steps. Then I stopped, because Varath Solankas was standing at the bottom of the steps, and he was not moving. Behind him were 2 of his court guards and his flat-eyed advisor, and the expression he was wearing was not the carefully contained one of a man deciding whether to be professional about something. It was the one people wear when they've stopped deciding. I had seen that expression before, in different settings, on different faces. It had a particular quality of absolute conviction, the kind that doesn't weigh options because it has already eliminated them. I had learned over the years to pay attention to it, not because it was dangerous on its own, because it tended to simplify the situations around it in ways that were hard to recover from. "You have no standing in this proceeding," he said. "The human species is not registered. Whatever the equipment produced, it cannot be a valid result under the Compact's bonding law. You are a medical officer. You are a guest on this station. You will withdraw your He searched for the word, "your interference, and you will do it now." I looked at him for a moment. He was taller than me by about 15 centimeters, and his shoulder structure was broader in the way the Solankas line ran, and his voice had the particular quality of someone who had spent his life being obeyed because of what he was standing next to, not because of what he was. "I submitted to a calibration scan," I said. "The equipment produced a result. I don't control what the equipment produces. That's the whole point of calibration. You did this deliberately." "I calibrated the equipment. That's what I was here to do." He took a step toward me. His guards took a step behind him. I did not move. I had been in enough situations where somebody needed to move and nobody did that. I had developed a fairly clear sense of how long a particular kind stillness could hold before it became something else. It held for about 4 seconds. Then a voice from behind Varath said quietly, "Kausen." He turned. Vathari Solankas was standing 2 meters away. She had not come with a guard escort. She was alone, and she was looking at her cousin with an expression that I can only describe as the face of someone who has been patient for a very long time, and just made a decision about where patience ends. "The tribunal has called a recess," she said. "We will wait for the tribunal. Tribunal cannot. The tribunal will determine what the tribunal can and cannot do." She said it without raising her voice. She didn't need to. "That is what tribunals are for, Varath. We will wait." He looked at her. Something moved through his face, not just frustration, but the specific frustration of a man who has spent 11 years watching a woman hold a position he thought should be his by right, and has never once managed to move her from it through sheer force of will. She had made him look directly at that fact, in front of his own guards, and he felt it. See him feel it. He turned and walked back toward the delegate ring. Vathari looked at me. "Dr. Faust," she said. She knew my name. She had, apparently, known it before this moment. She said it the way you say a name you've had for a while, not the way you say one you just learned. "You should know that whatever the tribunal rules, my court counsel will dispute it. I expect they will. Varath will petition for a registry challenge. He has legal grounds to argue that an unregistered species cannot produce a valid result under the Compact's language." "He might be right," I said. "I'm not a lawyer, I'm a medical officer." "You are," she agreed. "You are also, according to the equipment that you spent this morning, certifying as accurate and correctly calibrated. First biological match this station has recorded for a Solankas sovereign in 11 years. She paused. "I find that I would like to understand what that means before Varath and Dreveth finish arguing about what it's allowed to mean. What do you want to know?" She was quiet for a moment. The chamber around us had the subdued energy of people holding very careful conversations. Watching the Queen and the human medical officer standing at the base of the gallery steps without quite looking like they were watching. When you stood up in the gallery, she said, and asked to submit to the scan, was it because you thought that the equipment would produce this result? I answered her, honestly. No, I didn't think it would produce any result. You told me the equipment was working. I believed you. I thought I'd run a control baseline, get a clean red output, certify the equipment to spec, and go back to my seat. She studied my face. You did it because of the conference suite. I didn't answer that immediately, because she was right. And the answer to why she was right was something I wasn't sure I could put into words that would land the way I meant them, so I took a moment and tried to find the ones that would. You have been sitting in that chair for 3 days, I said. Watching 7 men fail a test you've been waiting 11 years for someone to pass. Your cousin has a conference suite booked. Your own counsel is looking for procedural workarounds instead of solutions, and you are handling all of it. All of it, with more composure than anyone in this room deserves from you. I paused. I stood up because there was one thing left to try, and everybody in that room with standing to try it had decided the outcome was already written. I don't have standing. I had nothing to lose. She looked at me for a long time. Long enough that I started to wonder if I'd overreached, said more than I should have, read the situation as something it wasn't. Then she said very quietly, nobody has told me, in 11 years of this proceeding, that what they were doing was for me. She seemed to notice that she had said it out loud. Something shifted in her expression. Not embarrassment, exactly, but the particular quality of a person who is accustomed to keeping certain things behind a very controlled face and has just let one through. I appreciate your candor, Dr. Faust. You're welcome, ma'am. You should also know, she said, and there was the faintest edge of something dry in her voice. Not quite humor, but adjacent to it, the tone of a person who has survived 11 years of impossible politics by finding occasional moments of the absurd in them. That if the tribunal rules the result is valid under the compact's language, you will have a great deal more to navigate than you are currently expecting. I nodded. I imagine I will. She studied me for one more second. Then she turned and walked back toward her seat, her guards falling in at a careful distance, and the room parted for her. The way rooms always parted for her. Because whatever the next 30 minutes produced, she was still the sovereign, and the room knew it. The tribunal recess ran 47 minutes. I spent it in the observer gallery with the treaty interpreter, who was a compact, precise woman named Ada, who had spent 12 years on Kestevan Station, and had, I gathered from the way she held herself during the pause, seen a great many things go sideways in tribunal chambers, and had developed a philosophical approach to the experience. She explained to me, in a low voice, what the numbers on the display had meant. The Solon-Cass bonding compact required a compatibility index of 60% or above on primary biological marker cross-match. The secondary and tertiary markers were confirmatory, useful for predicting long-term stability, not required for the initial verdict. The strongest registered candidate this session had scored a 41 on the primary. The second strongest, 44. The display had shown my primary cross-match at 87. Ada said it the way you say a number that you have double-checked twice and still can't quite believe. 87, she said. The secondary was 79. The tertiary was, she paused looking at her notes. Tertiary marker is for a specific Solon-Cass lineage characteristic. It doesn't apply to most species at all. The system usually records a null for non-Solon-Cass subjects. Yours was 63. What does that mean? It means the system found something in your biology that matched a lineage marker it wasn't expecting to find. She looked at me with the particular expression of a scientist who has encountered data they cannot yet explain and is deciding between fascination and alarm. Human biology hasn't been cataloged under the Solon-Cass registry protocols. Nobody's ever run the full panel. You might be, she stopped. An outlier? Possibly. Or human biology might have characteristics that are genuinely compatible with the Solon-Cass, markers in ways nobody knew to look for. The registry is built on species that voluntarily submitted samples for cataloging. Humanity has never participated in that process. She set her notes down. Dr. Faust, I want you to understand. I have been the interpreter for this tribunal for 3 sessions over 4 years. I have watched 49 registered candidates fail that scan. Some of them were specifically selected because predictive models suggested they might pass. None of them came within 30 points of what you scored today. I don't know what that means in biological terms, but I know what it means in legal terms. What does it mean? It means Varath Solankas is going to spend the next 6 hours trying to find a clause in the compact language that says an unregistered species cannot produce a valid result, and his lawyers are very good, and I believe they will find an argument that is at least arguable. She folded her hands. And it means that the tribunal's arbitrators are going to spend those same 6 hours reading the compact's foundational charter is 400 years older than the registry protocols. And they are going to find that the charter language says the scan result is binding if the equipment is certified as accurate. The registry protocols were written later, and they do not supersede the foundational charter. The human species was not excluded from the compact by the foundational charter. It was simply not included in the registry because nobody got around to it. I absorbed this. So the question is whether the omission is an exclusion. That is exactly the question. And the answer, legally, is almost certainly no. An omission is not an exclusion. And if the compact intended to exclude a species, the foundational charter required explicit language to that effect. There is no explicit language excluding humans. She paused. I have been watching these things for a very long time. I am telling you this not to give you legal advice. I'm an interpreter, not a lawyer, but because you are sitting in this gallery without any counsel at all, and I think you deserve to know what you are in the middle of. When the tribunal reconvened, the chamber had the quality of a room where people have chosen their positions during the interval and are now committed to holding them. Varath's legal team occupied the first row of the delegate ring in a tight cluster, their documentation out. Drevith had moved to a seat adjacent to the Queen's platform, which was a shift from his morning position, and which I read as, he had made a decision about where he stood if the result held. Vaithari herself was in her chair, straight-backed, hands on the arms. Face showed exactly nothing. The arbitrator addressed the chamber. She spoke for 11 minutes. I followed about half of it in real time from the interpreter's murmur, and reconstructed the rest afterward. The substance was this. The foundational charter of the Solankas Compact, ratified 412 years ago, specified that the bonding scan result was binding if conducted on certified equipment and produced a result above the required threshold. The registry of eligible species existed as a practical administrative tool, not as a condition of eligibility under the charter. An absence from the registry was not equivalent to a legal exclusion. No species had ever been explicitly excluded from eligibility in the charter's language. The human species had not submitted to the registry process, but there was no provision in either the charter or the registry protocols that made prior registry participation a prerequisite for a valid result. The tribunal's ruling, the result was valid. Varath was on his feet before the arbitrator had finished. His legal team was up with him. He addressed the tribunal in formal Solankas, not through the interpreter. A choice that I understood was deliberate because it framed this as a conversation that didn't require translation. That was between Solankas parties, and the human in the room was a piece of equipment rather than a person in it. Ada translated anyway. Voice didn't change. He was arguing that the ruling was politically motivated, that the human species had been inserted into these proceedings without proper vetting, that the Queen's Court should have the right to reject a result that came from outside the established process, that the compact had never intended this outcome, and the spirit of the law, if not the letter, was clear. The arbitrator waited for him to finish. Then she said in standard, "Counselor, the tribunal rules on the compact's text. If the compact intends to amend its foundational charter to include explicit species exclusions, it may bring that amendment through the proper channels. Today, we rule on the text as written. Is there anything further?" Varath looked at the arbitrator. Then he looked at the Queen. Then he looked at me. I was standing at the base of the gallery steps where I had been standing when the recess ended, because I hadn't gone back up. I'd stayed on the floor on the understanding that whatever happened next was going to happen fast. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has just lost something he spent 11 years believing was his, and is deciding, in real time, what to do with that. He sat down. His legal team sat down. In the quiet that followed, the arbitrator said, "The tribunal invites the parties to address the matter of compact ratification procedure." Dreveth stood. He spoke in standard now. Another deliberate choice, one that went in the opposite direction. He addressed the chamber, and through the chamber, the record. He said that the Queen's Court, having reviewed the tribunal's ruling, acknowledged the result as valid under the foundational charter. He said that the court was prepared to proceed with compact ratification proceedings on a timeline consistent with treaty protocol. He said that the court would, in parallel, submit the human species for formal registry inclusion, so that the record was complete. He sat down. The arbitrator looked at me. This was the moment where I was supposed to say something, and I knew it, and about 4 seconds to work out what that something was. The chamber was watching. Vareth's delegation was watching. Ada was watching. Dreveth was watching. Vathri Solankas was watching. I could feel her watching from across the room with the same quality of attention she had, turned on me at the water table, and all through the afternoon, and just now in the recess, the attention of someone who has been navigating a room full of people who want things from her, and has just identified the one person in the room, as far as she can tell, doesn't. I stepped forward until I was in the center of the chamber floor, beside the scan platform. I addressed the Queen, not the arbitrator. I did not use the formal register because I didn't have it, and the attempt would have been worse than the omission. I spoke plainly in standard, because that was what I had. Your Majesty, I let that settle. I am a human medical officer. I have no title, no court standing, and no business being in the middle of your compact proceeding. The equipment produced a result that surprised everyone in this room, including me. I cannot tell you what to do with it. That's not my place. Paused. What I can tell you is this. Whatever the tribunal has ruled, whatever the compact requires, whatever your court or Vareth's court or anyone else in this chamber wants, I think you should have a choice that belongs to you. So I'm asking you directly, in front of the record in this tribunal and everyone in this room, not as a candidate, not as a result on a display, as Rennick Faust, who gave you a cup of water this afternoon, and thinks you have been far more composed in this chamber than the situation required. I met her eyes. If you want me to stand beside you in whatever comes next, I'll stand beside you. If you don't, I'll file my calibration certification and go home. Either way, the choice is yours. The room was completely silent. I heard the ventilation system, heard Ada exhale very quietly at the end of the gallery. I heard from Vareth's delegation the sound of a person shifting their weight, and then deciding not to move further. Vathri Solankas looked at me from across the chamber. She had not moved from her chair. She was sitting in it the way she always sat in it, straight-backed, composed, hands on the arms, and her expression was still the precisely controlled one she wore in this room, the face of a sovereign who has been navigating impossible politics for 11 years, and has learned not to let the room read her unless she chooses to let them. Except that was not entirely true anymore. I was looking at her directly, and I had been watching her face all day, and I could see, not obviously, not in a way that the rest of the room would have clocked from a distance, that something had happened to the set, her jaw. Something had let go. The particular tension that lives in the face of a person who has been managing everyone around them for so long that they've started managing themselves against hope had, very quietly, eased. She didn't answer immediately. She let the silence hold for long enough that it was entirely her choice how long it held. And then she stood. She stood the way she sat, like someone who has done this in this kind of room, under this kind of pressure, for her entire adult life, and will not let the weight of it show. She came off the platform in 2 steps, walked to the center of the floor, and stopped in front of me, close enough that this was now between the two of us and the room around it. "Dr. Faust," she said. Voice was steady and precise and entirely hers. "The compact's ratification procedure requires that both parties submit a formal statement of sent before the tribunal record. The formal statement will be entered into the record. It is binding. I understand that too. She held my eyes. The copper amber of hers had a quality that I had noticed when she first looked at me at the water table, and was only now letting myself understand. There was a depth in them that was not just intelligence or composure. It was the depth of someone who had looked at a great many situations and a great many people, and had long since developed the capacity to see what was actually there rather than what she was told to see. She was using that now. "You are going to find," she said, "a great many people have very strong opinions about what this compact requires of you. I'm sure of that. And about what it requires of me, I expect so. And that navigating those opinions will occupy more of your time than you are currently imagining. Probably. There will be no easy version of the next several years." "I didn't come here looking for easy," I said. "I came here to certify biometric equipment." The corner of her mouth moved. Not a smile exactly. Something drier and more careful than a smile. The expression of a person who has not allowed themselves this particular degree of unguarded response in front of a room full of people in a very long time. She held it for exactly 1 second, and then it was gone, replaced by the composed sovereign face, but I had seen it, and I was not going to forget it. She turned to face the tribunal. "The Queen's Court acknowledges Dr. Rennick Faust of the Human Delegation as a valid respondent under the Solencast Foundational Charter," she said in standard, "for the record. The Queen's Courts submits a formal consent statement. The Queen consents." The arbitrator said, "Tribunal will enter the consent statement into the record." "Dr. Faust?" "The doctor consents," I said. "Formally, for the record." The arbitrator made the notation. Her colleague made the secondary notation. The third arbitrator, the one who had not spoken once during the entire session, made a notation of his own, and then looked up with the expression of someone who has just witnessed the most unexpected thing this station has produced in 20 years, and is privately finding it remarkable. "Tribunal records the compact as ratified," the arbitrator said. "Pending submission of the standard biometric documentation and registry filing, the human species, to be completed within 40 standard days. The tribunal thanks all parties for their participation." She paused. "This session is closed." Verth Solencast gathered his legal team and his delegation, and left the chamber without addressing anyone. His flat-eyed advisor glanced back at me once, from the door, with an expression I couldn't entirely read. Not hostility, exactly. Something more like recalculation. Drevith crossed the chamber floor and spoke to the Queen in Solencast for about 30 seconds. I didn't follow it. At the end of it he bowed, a short, formal bow, the kind that carries weight rather than theater, and then he looked at me and said in standard, "Dr. Faust, the court is grateful for your certification work today." A pause, measured and precise. Among other things, he left. The chamber emptied in the way places empty when a long and difficult thing has just concluded. Not quickly, because people had notes to gather and delegations to regroup, and the particular relieved exhaustion of a room that had been holding tension for hours. But with intention, the way water levels out when the pressure changes. Eventually it was just the two of us, and the scan platform in the middle of the floor, and the results array above it still showing the numbers that had changed everything. Vathari Solencast was standing at the platform's edge, looking at the display, or perhaps not looking at it, looking past it, at something I didn't have the angle on. I stayed where I was, giving her the space, not trying to fill the silence with anything it didn't need. After a while she said, "I would like to ask you something that is not for the record." "All right. When you were standing at the water table this afternoon, and you set the cup near my hand." She paused. "Why?" I thought about that for a moment. "You were standing alone," I said. "And you'd been in that chair for 3 days, and the water table was there." She turned and looked at me. "Seemed like the obvious thing to do," I said. The copper amber eyes held mine for a long moment. Psst. And this time there was no controlled sovereign face over what was in them, because we were alone in the room, and she had stopped performing for an audience. And what was in her eyes was the look of a person who has been told, by a series of days and years and institutional processes, that the situation is what it is and the outcome is what it is, and the best she can do is hold her position and manage it, and who has just today, in the last several hours, encountered someone for whom the situation was not what it had to be. She nodded slowly. the nod of someone whose composure is real but so is everything else behind it. It was, she said quietly, the obvious thing, yes. I walked her to the chamber doors. Not as an escort, she had guards for that, and they were waiting in the corridor, just as the person who was walking in the same direction, because we had come through the same room together, and we were leaving the same way. She walked at an unhurried pace, which was the only pace she seemed to have, and I matched it. And we didn't speak because there was nothing that needed to be said right now that couldn't wait. At the doors she stopped. Guards came to attention. She turned and looked at me one more time with those copper amber eyes, and I looked back at her, and we were both aware that this was the beginning of a very long and complicated thing that neither of us had been planning for this morning and that would require a great deal of both of us over the years ahead. Dr. Faust, she said. Ma'am, you should eat something, she said. I imagine you missed lunch. I had. I had been in the medical bay running calibration checks. She knew that because she'd already established that she paid attention to where people were and what they were doing. She had told me as much at the water table when she mentioned in her cousin's conference suite booking. I'll find something, I said. The station's officer's dining room is on level 4, she said. The food is adequate. The company at this hour will be quiet. Thank you, she nodded. One more of those precise weighted nods. Then she turned and walked into the corridor with her guards. And I stood in the doorway of the empty chamber for a moment, looking at the scan platform and the results array that was finally, after 11 years, showing something other than red. I went and found some dinner. She was right about the company. The dining room at that hour had 3 other officers in it, seated separately, none of them interested in me. I sat at a corner table with a tray of something that was warm and adequately flavored, and looked out the window at the Veth corridor, all that cold light and deep distance. I thought about what Ada had said, about what the numbers meant, about the foundational charter and the registry protocols, and the 40 days I now had to file documentation. I thought about the room, and Varath's face, and Dreveth's bow, and the particular quality of her expression when she said the obvious thing. I thought about a cup of water, set on a table near someone's right hand. I had been a medical officer for 14 years. I had been on assignment at Kestevan Station for 11 days. I had come here to certify equipment which I had done and which had produced a result that was going to change the next several years of my life in ways I wasn't yet equipped to calculate. There would be paperwork. There would be registry filings. There would be a very large number of people who wanted very specific things from this compact on both sides of it, and who were going to be extremely clear about what those things were. There would be Varath and his legal team, and whatever argument they found to bring next. There would be her court, and the 11 years of politics baked into every room she walked into. There would be an enormous amount that I was not ready for, and would have to become ready for quickly. I thought specifically about Counselor Dreveth's bow. Not the formal kind that court officials perform reflexively, the kind that means nothing except protocol. The short, weighted kind, the kind that carries a decision in it. He had looked at me and said, among other things, 3 words, spoken in standard, with the precision of a man who understood that the record would carry them, and who had chosen to put them there deliberately. That bow and those 3 words were Dreveth saying, in the language of a court that ran on implication and position. I was wrong about where this was going, and I am adjusting. He had been Vathari's counsel for, I didn't know how long, but long enough that his adjustments were calculated and not reflexive. That bow cost him something. People like Dreveth did not spend coin they didn't have to spend. I thought about Ada's face when she told me the tertiary marker score. She had been the interpreter for 3 sessions over 4 years, and she had watched 49 candidates fail. She had, by that point, the same certainty everyone else in the room had carried, that the machine would say, red, and the question was only what happened after. And then the display had shown 63, on a marker that usually produced a null, and her face had done the thing that faces do. When the model you've been working from doesn't hold any more, and you are rapidly constructing a new one. There was going to be a paper on this. Somebody, somewhere in the Compact's biological research establishment, was going to request the full panel data and write a paper on human compatibility markers and what they might mean about species biology at large. That paper was going to be uncomfortable for a number of people who had staked positions on the assumption that the registry was complete. I was, apparently, evidence that it wasn't. I ate my dinner, and I thought, there are worse things than an impossible result, produced by a piece of equipment you spent the morning certifying, on a platform you stood on because somebody had to, and nobody withstanding would. There are worse things than a cup of water, set near someone's hand. She had said, there will be no easy version of the next several years. I had said, I didn't come here looking for easy, that was true. I had come here to do a job, and I had done it. And the job had turned out to be larger than the brief. That happens sometimes. You calibrated for the situation you expected, and then you stood in the one you got, and you made your choice, and you lived in it. I had made mine at the base of the gallery steps, in plain standard, in front of the record and the tribunal and everyone. I'll stand beside her. I wasn't going to say it again. It had been said once, in the right room, at the right moment, and the room had heard it, and she had heard it, and the record had it. Some things don't need to be repeated, they need to be done. I finished eating, paid the table, went back to my quarters on the station's residential level, where my calibration documentation was waiting for me on the desk, and I sat down and began filing it. The official certification, the baseline results, the full biometric panel that nobody had thought to run before. I worked until the corridor outside was quiet, and the station's cycle had moved to its low-light period. At some point, a message arrived from the human delegation's senior attaché. It was brief and professional. The delegation was aware of the day's developments, seeking guidance from the Home Office, and, in the meantime, requested that I make no further public statements about the compact result until Council had been consulted. This was entirely sensible advice. I would, in the days ahead, largely follow it. At some point after that, a second message arrived. No delegation header, no formal address, it said. The documentation submission window opens at 0700 station time. The registry filing can be submitted in parallel. I recommend beginning with the biological baseline data. It will draw the most scrutiny. Clean documentation shortens the challenge window considerably. It was signed. D. Drevith. Her counsel, who had spent 2 days treating me like a piece of furniture, was giving me filing advice at 11 o'clock at night because he had decided where he stood and was acting accordingly. I read it twice. Then I added his recommendations to my submission queue. There was going to be a great deal more work than this. There always was. I filed the last document, saved the package, kept it ready for submission. Then I turned off the desk light and sat for a moment in the dark, listening to the ventilation system of a neutral station at the edge of compact space, and thought about copper amber eyes and a woman who had held her position for 11 years against everything that wanted her to move, and a cup of water that she had picked up because someone had put it near her hand. Some things are the obvious thing to do. You just have to be the one who does them.